He said if there is a battleship use of force, an emergency in Taiwan, then that could constitute a situation threatening the survival of Japan in any way you slice it. Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi addressing the parliament. In recent weeks, Tokyo has moved swiftly to bolster its defences, announcing that it will go ahead with the deployment of a medium-range surface-to-air missile unit on Yonaguni Island, a remote outpost just 110 kilometres from Taiwan's coast. The move has triggered an intense diplomatic backlash from Beijing, which accuses Japan of raising regional tensions and stirring a potential military confrontation. Japanese Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi reiterated on Sunday that the plan is fully on schedule and that the primary objective is deterrence, not provocation. He stated, "We believe that having this unit in place will actually lower the chances of an armed attack against our country." For Tokyo, the message is clear. In the current strategic environment, restraint may be less secure than readiness. The decision marks the latest phase of a broader Japanese military build-up. Earlier this year, Japan's self-defense forces conducted a missile test on home territory, the first of its kind, signaling a departure from previous norms. That test in June saw a Type 88 surface-to-ship missile launched off Hokkaido, reflecting the sense of urgency in Tokyo about the evolving security landscape. At the heart of this shift is the worsening strategic calculus surrounding Taiwan and the East China Sea. Beijing regards Taiwan as a breakaway province and has not ruled out force to bring it under its control. Tokyo, meanwhile, has long kept its public policy deliberately vague on whether a Chinese attack on Taiwan would trigger Japanese military involvement. But Takaichi's remarks constitute a sharper pivot. She framed a Taiwan contingency as an existential threat to Japan, signalling that Japan would view an attack on Taiwan as a direct threat to its own survival and, by implication, earn the option for military response under its security laws passed in 2015. Beijing reacted swiftly and forcefully. At a regular press briefing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning rejected the missile deployment as extremely dangerous and accused right-wing forces in Japan of leading the region toward disaster. China has also responded with a range of economic and diplomatic countermeasures, including bans on Japanese seafood imports, halting Japanese movie releases in China, and issuing travel advisories against visiting Japan. In Taipei, however, the reaction was more measured. Deputy Foreign Minister Francois Wu affirmed that Japan, as a sovereign state, has the right to take steps needed to protect the security of its territory. He added, Japan's strengthening of its relevant military facilities is basically helpful to maintaining security in the Taiwan Strait. He emphasized that Japan has no territorial designs or hostility towards Taiwan. The strategic logic from Tokyo's perspective is anchored in geography. Yonaguni lies closer to Taiwan than to Japan's main islands and is considered one of the most exposed frontier points of Japanese territory. From Tokyo's vantage, deploying a missile unit there helps harden its southwestern flank and extends the reach of its anti-access area denial, a 2AD architecture, in the face of Chinese naval and air expansion. Analysts point to the broader context of increasing Chinese sortie operations and carrier group activities near Japanese waters, including the entry of a Chinese carrier group into Japan's exclusive economic zone around Minamotori Island earlier this year. For Japan, the deployment sends three interlocking messages. One, to domestic audiences that Tokyo is stepping up to defend its islands. Two, to Washington and other regional partners that Japan is assuming a more robust posture in alliance with the US. And three, to Beijing, that Japan is willing, under the current leadership, to act more proactively in defense of its interests. Yet, Tokyo's critics caution that the deployment risks triggering a spiral of militarization. Beijing's denunciations have already accelerated. Mainland commentators have argued that Japan is undermining regional stability under the cover of alliance dynamics. Some analysts fear that Japan's incremental shift toward counterstrike and extended deterrence capabilities may erode the post-World War II norm in Tokyo of strictly self-defensive posture. See Guardian, March 2000. and 25. From Beijing's perspective, Japan's move is sensitive because it lies at the convergence of multiple flashpoints: the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, and the broader US-China strategic competition. The deployment may further blur the line between defense and offense in the eyes of China and complicate Tokyo's balancing act between alliance commitments and regional reassurance. Japan insists that the missile unit is designed for defensive operations and island defense scenarios, not offensive strikes against the mainland. Yet the optics matter. Stationing such capability on an island barely 110 kilometers from Taiwan's coast will inevitably be interpreted by Beijing through a security dilemma lens. At this juncture, Tokyo has stressed that the deployment is not a reaction to a specific event, but a structural response to an increasingly contested regional order. The Japanese government's revised security strategy in 2022 already marked a turn toward a more assertive posture. This current deployment is an operationalization of that strategy. Meanwhile, nearly 4,000 kilometers to the southwest, another diplomatic front is heating up between neighbors India and China. On 21 November 2025, at Shanghai's Pudong Airport, an Indian citizen from Arunachal Pradesh encountered prolonged detention while transiting through China. She alleges that Chinese immigration officers declared her Indian passport invalid because her birthplace was listed as Arunachal Pradesh, a territory claimed by Beijing as part of South Tibet. She reported that officials held her for about 18 hours, denied her access to basic facilities and boarding, and told her she should apply for a Chinese passport. They called my Indian passport invalid as my birthplace is Arunachal Pradesh, which they claimed is Chinese territory, she said. New Delhi's response was sharp. The Indian government issued a formal diplomatic protest, stating that the passenger had been detained on ludicrous grounds and that Arunachal Pradesh is indisputably Indian territory. The Ministry of External Affairs and the Indian consulate in Shanghai intervened and extended consular assistance to the traveller. Beijing rejected the claim of harassment, stating that all immigration checks were conducted in accordance with laws and regulations. The episode has stirred commentary within India, where opposition parties called for a firmer government response, arguing that such incidents undermine the dignity of Indian citizens abroad. The incident comes at a delicate moment in India-China relations. Earlier this year, the two sides had signalled a thaw in their strained ties, agreeing in January 2025 to resume direct air services and journalist exchanges after several years of frozen links following the 2020 border clashes. In December 2024, India had officially declared its readiness to pursue broader engagement with China following the resolution of a Himalayan standoff. Against this backdrop, the Passport Row incident threatens to derail the momentum of bilateral normalization. For India, the incident touches on two vital issues: the right of its citizens to travel freely and the territorial integrity of Arunachal Pradesh. For China, it embodies the persistent border and territorial dispute that remains a recurring irritant in bilateral relations. In practical terms, the event may add fresh strain to diplomatic channels, complicating other cooperation efforts, even as both sides talk of improving ties. Taken together, these two episodes, Japan's missile deployment and the India-China passport dispute, reflect how Asia's major powers are navigating intersecting domains of defense policy, national sovereignty, and diplomatic signaling. In Tokyo, the shift is toward a more forward-leaning military posture. In New Delhi and Beijing, the friction is rooted in border politics and citizens' rights. From a humanitarian and civil society vantage point, two themes stand out. First, how the lives of ordinary citizens can become entangled in strategic competition, whether on a remote Japanese island or at an airport transit zone. Second, the way states frame and manage those human dimensions carries implications not only for diplomacy, but for how trust and legitimacy are perceived by publics. In Japan's case, the Yonaguni deployment involves questions of how island communities will be defended and what kind of sacrifices may be asked of remote residents. In the India-China case, the detained passengers' ordeal underscores how travel, nationality and identity increasingly intersect with geopolitics. Looking ahead, three key variables will shape how these stories evolve. In Japan-China relations, whether the missile deployment triggers further military posturing or prompts crisis management diplomacy. Will Tokyo scale back or accelerate? Will Beijing respond with maritime air pressure or open dialogue? In India-China ties, whether the passport incident becomes an isolated protest or a wedge issue that complicates broader cooperation. Will India press alternatives such as compensation, diplomatic measures or bilateral legal mechanisms? Will China change transit policy practices or maintain its current posture? For regional civil society and individual rights, will we see greater transparency, recourse and restitution when citizens are caught in interstate friction? For example, will the Indian traveller's case lead to policy changes in how China processes transit passengers? Will Japan engage more deeply with community stakeholders on island defence? In sum, Asia's current diplomatic map is shaped not only by treaties and military hardware, but by small moments of human friction, each one a potential lens into the shifts in power, identity and agency. As governments move to enhance their security posture or safeguard sovereignty, the ripple effects for civilians and cross-border mobility are increasingly consequential. The optics are stark: one remote Japanese island decades after the Cold War, one passenger in Shanghai's transit lounge. But both scenes speak to a broader story: the re-emergence of territorial logic, the strategic integration of defence and diplomacy, and the concrete human costs at the intersection of national ambition and individual life. It is worth keeping an eye on how each government manages escalation. Will Tokyo's missile move become a flashpoint, or will it quietly embed into the status quo of island defence? Will New Delhi's protest over transit harassment spark sustained policy change or lapse into bureaucratic normality? For civil society actors, the imperative remains: monitor not just the grand strategy, but the small acts of resistance, the detained traveller, the islander's fear of being caught in the crossfire. Finally, for multimedia storytelling and humanitarian coverage, each of these narratives offers compelling elements: the geostrategic missiles, islands, alliances; the personal traveller detained citizen rights; the human rights dimension, detention, mobility, sovereignty; and the domestic discourse's public support, protest minority concerns. Integrating voices of island residents, transit travellers, borderland communities can elevate the story beyond the diplomatic headline to the lived realities behind the policy.